Okay, welcome to the very first History on the Box vlog. I'm Stan Neal. I'm a teaching fellow in history at the University of Leicester. For those of you who haven't been to History on the Box before, it's basically a blog space where PhD students at the University of Leicester review historical television programmes. So that ranges from dramas to documentaries, and the idea is that they apply their academic expertise to these programmes, which are obviously designed for the public. Today we're going to try something new. We have two PhD researchers who will be debating about Lucy Worsley's Six Wives programme. And the motion for this debate is that Lucy Worsley's Six Wives is an effective and innovative approach to popular history. We've got Liz Round, who will be arguing for the motion. Liz is an AHRC Midlands Three Cities funded PhD student in the Centre for English Local History at the University of Leicester, and her research explores clergy-lay relationships in 17th century Herefordshire. And Katie Bridger will be arguing against the motion, and Katie is a PhD student in the Centre for English Local History at the University of Leicester, and her thesis is entitled Expression and the Landscape, the Leicestershire Gentry. And that's roughly from 1460 to 1540. So before I hand over to these guys to debate this TV programme, I think I'll give a little bit of a background for those of you who might not have seen the programme. Lucy Worsley's Six Wives is a documentary series which features dramatic reconstruction. And in this setup, the presenter literally revisits key events in the lives of Henry VIII's Six Wives as a sort of time traveller. She's disguised in contemporary clothing, and she physically witnesses the key events sort of take place around her. So it's a twist on the more conventional history sort of documentary. And it aired over 3 episodes on BBC One in December 2016. I've had a look at some of the reviews in newspapers and media outlets, and they're very mixed. Review titles range from The Six Wives of Lucy Worsley shows an engagingly different side to Henry VIII's wives, to It's time for Six Wives with Lucy Worsley was taken to the Tower. So there's a real sort of debate going on around the way that this programme was done, and that obviously sets up what we're going to talk about today very well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our debaters. Liz is going to make the case for the proposition first, and then Katie will make her case, and then we'll have a short break and give them both the chance to respond. So I'll hand over to you, Liz. Can you please tell us why Lucy Worsley's Six Wives is an effective and innovative approach to popular history?
Thank you. Yes, I can. I think to those of us who regularly watch British terrestrial television programming, and there is a sense that the airwaves are oversaturated with certain subjects. And anything to do with scandal, with royalty, with castles, with World War II, or even better, some combination of things seem to dominate the airwaves. And I think this programme, this series, certainly fits the bill of that, being about royalty, and scandalous royalty to boot. Done to death is the oft-quoted verdict, and I think, if I'm honest, I've thought and said that myself about it. But in the course of preparing for this debate, I stopped to question whether done to death is really a fair basis on which to condemn this series. And I must admit, if the debate was centred around whether the series related anything new about the 6 women concerned, then I would simply have to hold up my hand and admit defeat right here, because it doesn't, for the most part. One exception is in Worsley's assertion that historians have been unfair to Catherine Howard, the idea that rather than depicting her as a good time girl, today we would refer to her as an abuse victim. Now, perhaps the idea of her being a victim of child abuse is an anachronistic idea, but what is undeniable is that there have been a number of books and several television series that propose to do exactly what Worsley has done here, which is exploring the wives from their perspective rather than from Henry's. But the debate here is asking whether Worsley's presentation of the topic, the method by which she presented it, is effective and innovative. In one sense, in a very real sense, yes it is. After all, the story is not only not new when you've heard it before, and Worsley, I think, seems to have a real gift but engaging with people who fall outside the traditional audience, the history television documentaries. And I think we have to admit as academics that those kinds of programmes aren't made for us. Public history or popular history in the media is quite simply a means of teaching and engaging with those who do not already know their history through entertainment. Those who might have heard the old rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, maybe not really thought very much about what it meant to the women concerned, or who wanted to learn anything more about their lives other than the scandal. And this series left out a lot about the women concerned, a lot of important details. So, for example, Anne Cleves had a very controlling brother, and so for her, what Henry offered in the divorce settlement seemed like a dream come true. And while the lack of these details do sometimes lead to accusations of dumbing down, I prefer to ask this: are these kinds of programmes always going to tell everything about the topic, or are they intended rather to be a beginning? As Emma Wilmer pointed out in 2000, public history is about giving people a chance to form their own ideas about history, to create their own version of history, be that simple stories, essays, works of art, dissertations, or at the end of the day, jokes down the pub. And it's often said that history belongs to everyone, not just those in universities. And it's this kind of history programme that can help to democratise history, spread knowledge, to help people understand their past. And if they're interested, they can always learn more through more conventional means, like a book. And I think most historians will accept that since the days of E.H. Carr and A.J.P. Taylor, that the presentation of history on television in documentary format has changed a great deal. From static talking head presenting in a very straight and boring sense, to exciting documentaries with reconstructions and interviews with academic historians, with primary sources being shown and engaged with. Is this another step forward from that? I think it is, although I'm not convinced it is a format that would work for every historical topic. Here it works because it's taken a topic that many people know a little bit about. Even if they've no interest in watching history documentaries ordinarily, they might have watched The Willing Girl or The Tudors, the Showtime series that aired a few years ago. Six Wives is different in that, apart from Worsley, there are no academics. The history is foregrounded, whether that's through showing primary sources or reconstructed dramatisation, which we view through Worsley's somewhat voyeuristic eyes. I mean, I think she's a pretty decent actress herself, or just a historian caught up in the moment. Either way, we can see, for example, her immense sadness when she views Catherine appearing in court at Blackfriars in 1529 to plead for her marriage. We see her joy at the new relationship forming and the love forming between Henry and Anne. It's easy to dismiss the importance of Worsley's role here because as historians, past can feel very immediate and alive, and the people that we study often feel very real to us. But to those who do not immerse themselves in the study of history as we do, people from the past can appear as stereotypes, as cardboard characters. Worsley alludes to this in the beginning with the rhyme and goes on to point out where the image differs from the reality. Catherine Parr as the boring one, for example, or Catherine of Aragon as the bitter, twisted, religious one. The dramatisations of Worsley's presence brings them alive and into our present. Worsley doesn't say anything very much that is new about the wives. And to be honest, I think that's incredibly difficult to do anyway, barring the discovery of a new primary source that sheds new light on someone from the period. But her new means of presenting the history, of engaging with people, is something that should be evaluated carefully. It may not work for all historical television programming. The thought of, say, Jeremy Paxman dressing as an Indian servant for his 2012 Empire series is quite simply silly. But for this kind of topic, I think it is extremely effective and it's one worth exploring further.
Okay, thank you very much, Liz. That's an excellent sort of defence of this programme. And we're now going to hand over to Katie, who's going to explain why Lucy Worsley's Six Wives is not an effective and innovative approach to popular history.
Okay, Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I just want to lead by saying that any of the arguments that I put forward, I'm not attempting to detract from the amazing amount of effort and work that went into the production of this show, because if you look behind the scenes, you can see that there is an awful amount of work that has gone into it. But my argument is really constructed on a series of frustrations that I felt with this programme. And as a historian of 16th century England, or 15th, but mainly 16th, you might think that oh brilliant, there's another documentary on the Six Wives. But when I found out that there was going to be another one, it was sheer exhaustion. I just couldn't really see how this was going to be something new. And whilst the debate isn't so much about telling us new history, I think some of that has to be considered when we're thinking about how innovative this approach actually is. Because in rehashing what essentially is the same old story, you run the risk of turning people off, quite frankly, of this period. There is a claim that there are new things being shown in this documentary, and if you were going to try and do a sort of a pointless style or bingo style quiz, name the top 6 things that might appear in a Tudor documentary on Six Wives, you might see Catherine of Aragon's speech at the Blackfriars, which was an incredibly important period of event in history, but you might see Anne Boleyn present the ship with the diamond to Henry in the court. You might see Catherine Howard place her head on the block and practice. And whilst these are, of course, really important events in their own right, you can tell an awful lot from these events. It's not the only, that doesn't complete this Tudor world that has sort of descended to us, this series of characters that we're presented with. This would have been a perfect opportunity to move away from the court, which might sound silly if you're considering a documentary about the Six Wives, but they were women in their own right who lived lives away from the court. Perhaps that would have been a really interesting opportunity to showcase some of the properties involved. And I think Hever Castle was shown, and I think Hampton Court. So Lucy did visit quite a few of these properties, which I think was great. But it was a brilliant opportunity to show people, to try and get away from this stereotype of, oh, you research 16th century England, oh, do you mean Henry VIII? Or, oh, you research 15th century England, do you mean Richard III? There is so much more that can be said about the Henrician court, which admittedly is a very well-ploughed field. But I think if you're really going to put forward this approach of, we're going to talk about from the women's perspective, there are other ways of doing it. So, for example, you could have used the letters that Catherine of Aragon wrote to her Spanish ambassador. That's very telling of her personal perspective. And what I seem to pick up, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to just be getting the same story being rehashed, but maybe thinking about how the women may have had their own agenda, but still Henry was at the centre of the court. I know he was the king, but this programme was about the Six Wives. The second point that I want to make is probably one of the most obvious ones, but I do have a problem with the dressing up. I will be the first to champion living history, historical reenactment. When you think about time travel, massive Doctor Who fan, so absolutely, go for it with time travel. But I just can't see how the two gel together. When I say I appreciate historical reenactment, I think it's so important to try and spark people's imagination. So people who perhaps can't visualise, who haven't, as Liz said, spent their lives sort of immersed in this court, you can't maybe conjure exactly what Anne Boleyn might have been wearing. And I think Worsley's done this really well in the past, where she's shown how costumes have been constructed. She's talked about the physical element of how people dressed. I think she dressed up as Elizabeth I once, and it was incredibly bulky and awkward. And that's a really interesting and I think useful way of projecting immersive history. But I just think that in a documentary, which this is, its identity is a documentary, it's difficult to have someone being the observed and the observer. I just don't think it gels. I don't think it works. I felt uncomfortable because one minute Lucy was wearing this lovely dress, actually, a lovely rose dress, and wandering around. I think she went to Alhambra and various places, and showing us different parts of the country and other countries that are relevant to the story. And then suddenly she's in this sort of servant's outfit and she's eavesdropping. I get the immersive history, that by seeing a familiar face, by seeing somebody who we've seen in various other documentaries involved in this world, seeing this world, picking up, I don't know, Catherine Aragon's bed sheets. I get that a lot of people will find that incredibly effective, and I'm not taking anything away from that, but if you read some of the reviews, there is almost a sense of, is this what we've come to? You know, are we really at such a loss with new things to say or with new ways to present that we've potentially made it almost vulnerable to, not ridicule per se, but certainly criticism, in that people don't necessarily take it seriously, that we have to dress up. And again, I'm not saying that about living history or historical reenactment, but I don't think the presenter, the historian, needs to be dressing up. Other historians don't do it. Just because there is a mould doesn't mean you shouldn't question the mould. Absolutely, break it if you must. But try and figure out new ways of doing things. I think, commendably, that's what Worsley's tried to do. She's tried to find another way of showing this period, of expressing this period of history. But you don't see Dr. Michael Scott in his recent programme on Delphi wandering around in, you know, contemporary dress. He exposes the core of his discipline, which I think is absolutely what sort of Liz was picking up on, that you've got to show people, go back to the basics, show people the process of history. It doesn't come in this neatly packaged little box with a ribbon and a bow and this colourful Tudor court, we know exactly what everyone said. It's really all about going back to the basics, showing people the tools of the trade, as it were. And I think that is a way that could have made the show quite innovative. And sort of building on that, this relationship between historians and the public, I feel really strongly, and I can't quite think about this without having my sort of 16th century historian head on, but I think that we have a responsibility for people who have researched periods of history that are well ploughed. We have a responsibility not to sort of wear it further and further down into the ground so that people don't want to know more about it. It's possibly one of the most well-ploughed fields in history, Henry VIII and his six wives, but we shouldn't give up on thinking that there's nothing more to be said. We need to show people that this period, which as far as I know has been moved back to primary curriculum, so if you think about it, a lot of people will only get their exposure to the period when they're at school. They might go to Hever Castle, go to Hampton Court, but I think you have to try and capture people who maybe didn't do it at school. I mean, I was really lucky, I managed to do it again at A-level, and I was very taken with this story. It was this story that got me so much into Tudor history, so I'm not saying that we shouldn't be telling it again. I just don't think we should be rehashing it. But we owe it to this period of history not to wear it down to the point that people don't want to know about it anymore. There are many, many other characters, colourful characters, brilliant stories that can be told. And I think we have to reach this point where we start to say, right, this isn't just what we know in a packaged box. This is what we think we know, but what do you think? And start to get people questioning the things that we know, query it. I mean, Liz was talking about our perception of some of the wives, particularly Catherine Howard. Again, I do agree that it is quite an anachronistic perspective, but there's life to it, there's movement, there's progress, and I think that's what we need to do with history. We need to keep rethinking about these people and the way they lived and the different elements that affected their lives. And as I was saying about Dr. Michael Scott, he showed us the tools of his trade. He was walking around Delphi, I think he showed some ruins, he showed us artefacts. He's an archaeologist, I think. Sorry if he's not. But there was another brilliant programme recently on the lost city of Atlantis, and there was a geologist, and I don't really speak geology. It's like its own language almost. But this geologist did a fantastic job. They took us to the rock face, They showed us these different sort of strata in the rock. They showed us pumice stone, and that was evidence for this giant volcanic explosion that had happened. So instead of being there and running away from the volcano, they just took us back to the basics. They showed us, as geologists, this is what we're faced with, and this is the conclusion that we've drawn. Same with archaeologists. We're digging, this is an object. From this object, we can recreate a pot. Sometimes you get some fantastic CGI in these programs. You get this really cool brick noise and all the buildings just rise up from the ground, and I think that's excellent. But still, it's showing people, it's honest with people about where those ideas have come from. And I think what we need to do is get people back to the archives, show people that archives are not just for historians. National Archives, you can get a reader's ticket, you can go in there. It doesn't just have to be about military history and family history, which has done brilliantly for sort of breaking down the wall between people and archives. But I think people need to understand that the archives are theirs too. In any period of history, anyone can learn to read handwriting. It's brilliant fun. And I just can't see how the show managed to show that. Maybe that wasn't the point so much. But I think showing the letter from Henry Gates Van Blin in the Vatican, which was an amazing achievement to be able to film that, I think so much more focus should have been placed on that document. So don't just pick out the bit that's the focus of that segment. Show people the document more, show them the handwriting more. There's some stuff in that letter that's pretty racy, and I think would have made for some really good television as well. But by all means, just show people that the way that we have created this Henrician court that Lucy is a part of in her dressing up, we've elevated it from manuscripts. It hasn't just descended in this foregone conclusion. And I think the public need to be able to be made to feel a part of that. So I'll stop there. I could go on, but yeah, that's why I believe it's not an effective and innovative approach.
Well, thank you, Kate. So they're actually picking out some of the things you think the programme should have focused more on, rather than just saying, oh, it's rubbish. There's actually a lot of good in there that could maybe be sort of refocused or emphasised. We're now going to hear from Liz, who's going to sort of counter some of those criticisms.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Katie, for that criticism of the programme. And there's a lot there to think about, clearly, and I've got a lot to respond with. But I'm going to take your points in order, same order that you gave them with, if that's okay. First of all, the idea that it's the same old story. And I think while you're right in that more could be done with the programme, so for example, giving your example about going and visiting more of the houses and making more of the women away from the court, I think you're absolutely right about that. I also think that with history programmes in general, they can't do everything. It's like an essay. You've got to decide what the focus of the essay is and stick to it, because you can't possibly hope to cover everything. And I think in this case, what they've done is to actually decide that they're going to make this the focus of trying to engage with a new audience, of trying to engage in a new way, rather than trying to show something new about the wives. And I think if you're going to show something new about the wives, you have to make a different type of programme. Do I think there is scope for that kind of programme? Absolutely, and I would be one of the first to watch it. But I don't think that this one is the right one to do it with. There's so many different types of history programmes out there. You've got the fantastic Time Watch series, which is all about historiography, for example. You've got Paxman Post series, which I mentioned earlier. Michael Scott series, all in Greece and showing Venice and places like that. And they're brilliant, and they're all covering history, but they've all got different shares of their audience, if you like, and not everybody will always like every single type of approach. So I think there's room for everybody to feel different approaches to history, very much so. And I think also with expectations, you said that it covers the same events, that there is more to say. I think there's also the thing that people do expect to see certain things, like Catherine Howard playing Block Catherine walking out of the court. There are certain things that, if you don't see them, they're going to be kind of left hanging. And I know that when I'm watching a television programme, a history television programme, I kind of actually get a certain amount of glee out of predicting what's going to come next. And when I get it right, I high five my partner. You know, I enjoy that. That's the kind of thing that makes me happy. So, you know, there is that kind of aspect of it as well. That kind of repetition may not always necessarily be a bad thing from the point of view of the audience. In terms of the immersive experience, dressing up versus dressing up, I think maybe it is more for Worsley's benefit. But I don't agree that she should be either the observer or the observed. I think there is a role to be played in, as you said, the idea of her going back in time and viewing it. She's bringing those events into our present. She's acting as the viewer for us. And that's how I see it. And I think she's very careful. I mean, there's one point where, for example, Henry and Catherine are having a blazing row, and she's peeking around the corner, and he walks out of the room and nearly slams into her. And she's very quickly ducking down. She's behaving exactly as a court servant would be at the time, except for the fact the court servant wouldn't be peeking around the corner. But she's ducking her head and hiding. And that, I think, is quite illustrative of how she Worsley sees herself in that kind of role. She's trying not to be... Just take Star Trek, for example. If you've gone back in time in Star Trek, one of the first things you have to learn how to do is not to be observed as being somebody from a different culture. And I think that's essentially what Worsley is doing almost. She's trying not to be observed by the people who are in the dramatisation, so that they don't realise that she's a modern woman, even though we all know she's acting. It sounds kind of weird, but that's what I think is going on. You pointed out that this is an extended imagined dialogue, and I think, Worsley mentioned right at the beginning of the series, and I think at the beginning of every single programme, that what we are seeing in those reconstructions is based on witness statements, on letters, on things that we know actually happened. So I'm not sure that imagined is really the right way to use. Maybe we'll then move this into modern language, because as we know, Henry and Anne Boleyn, for example, wrote to each other in French, as we said in the programme. Anne Cleves would have spoken something in Flemish, I think. So English wasn't always used, and many modern people might not even understand a great deal of what had been said in that period, even when it was in English. So they have definitely modernised the language, but that doesn't mean that I think it's imagined dialogue so much. I think as for what you said about other historians not dressing up, admittedly, it's not a style that will suit everybody, as I said. Certainly packed me. Michael Stott, much as many people might wish to see him in a Greek paper, I do think that for Worsley it absolutely works, and no more power to her if she's going to do it. So go for it. In terms of history in the public, I do agree with a lot of what you said here. I think there is a new approach of going back to basics, of showing people how to question the sources, how to question the history. So a little bit of it here. She said when she points out that Anne Cleves has been depicted as being the ugly one. Actually, she was very beautiful. And I went back and looked through some of the older versions of Henry VIII's wife from 1973, Keith Mitchell. Anne Cleves in that programme is really ugly. She's been made to look ugly. And that's not questioning the primary sources of the story at all. Whereas what Worsley was saying, was actually questioning it and showing how to do that in an effective way. Let's just do a tiny bit of that. And in other programmes that she's just done a series where she's looked at historiography, for example. She looked at Richard III, she looked at India, another one was I can't remember. But she does question what people have said all the way along. So, for example, in Richard III, she said about how the Wars of the Roses, the name the Wars of the Roses was very much a Victorian invention, that kind of thing. So yes, there's room for a new approach, there's room for a new history. I very much agree that we should take it back to basics, teach people how to question. And while this may not be the way to go, in the sense of everybody should do it, I don't think that. I do think it's perhaps one way in which certain people can go on certain subjects.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Lou. That was a very sort of detailed response to some of Katie's points. Katie, how would you respond to that and what was said before as well?
I can try. No, I think you do make some really valid points, and absolutely I appreciate the effort that Worsley has gone to in her attempt to be innovative. I cannot take away from her gift for engagement. She is very engaging lady. She is fantastic at delivering to the camera. I saw a YouTube video actually. She was trying on some clothes with about how a Tudor lady would dress, and she had a little girl next to her, and she was the one trying on the clothes, and her manner was just so easy, and I really appreciate that about her. So if somebody's going to try and push the presentation of these people forward, I do think that she should probably be one of the ones at the helm. But just as much as this gift for engagement does engage with people who want to see certain elements from a show on the Six Wives, so you're saying that you must have Catherine Howard practicing on the block because certain people are going to expect certain things. But I feel that's quite sort of a stagnant approach. By all means, refer to it. By all means, have a very brief clip of it to be able to give people something to anchor the story to anchor the points that they're already familiar with. But don't leave the other people behind, because there are some people who don't really know much about the Six Wives and want to know about this period of history because it's just something to watch, or because they want to know a little bit more, or they're interested in pursuing the topic further. But there are people, I'm not just talking about historians, I'm talking about people who have gleaned bits of this story through their lives, through their childhood, through their adult lives, and they do want to be told something new. Just thinking of my granddad particularly, he is one of the main reasons as to why I'm very interested in Tudor history. I remember going to Hever Castle with him. He used to tap me on the shoulder and say it was Anne Boleyn. So he's very, very engaged with this period, but he felt quite sort of like, it's been done before. As much as he likes Worsley, he loves her, he thinks she's fantastic, I think he still felt that it was the same story. And you're absolutely right, programmes cannot tell you everything about a topic. If that was the case, we would have one constant Henry VIII and the Six Wives channel going on, which actually might go down quite well for some people. But I think even if the focus is the Henrician court and the Six Wives, at least tell them the story in a way that they want to know more. Leave some loose ends. Almost query. You mentioned there was an element of sort of querying what we know, but do that a little bit more. Say, well, in recent years people have begun to see Catherine Howard as sort of victim of abuse, but then maybe give a slight counter-argument. And I know there is a constraint in television. You must keep to a certain time frame, and you can't go too far beyond the main focus of the programme. But I still think there is some sort of wiggle room in indicating other bits. I mean, you don't necessarily have to take people out to National Trust and English Heritage Properties, but there are ways and means of just highlighting other things that might make people think slightly differently. Like, I mean, I'm a landscape historian, but mention landscape history, or mention a discipline that people aren't so familiar with, because that might make them query things a little bit more and turn their previous perspective of the show on its head. And I think that's one of the points of historical documentaries. It's not just to tell people what they already know, it's to tell them something that they don't know. And I've written history absolutely belongs to everyone. I don't think it should just remain in universities. I feel very strongly that we should all be sharing our research. And in terms of what I just said about querying, I think that's how it becomes a part of everybody's sort of prerogative to question it, to query it. It's all of our history. I mean, it doesn't just belong to the university. So I think there definitely needs to be more, as I said, loose ends. I really loved what you said about Lucy being a historian caught up in the moment. You know, you could get me whizzing out into Leicestershire and having a look at my gentry, but I probably wouldn't dress up. But I'd find that really exciting, and it shows her passion, it shows her enthusiasm, not only for the Tudor period, it shows it for fashion, history of fashion, costume history. But I do have a problem with the portrait in the car. As much as you might be enthused about the topic, I don't know if you need to travel with the portrait of the person with you. But Liz, in that break, you did make a really important point that it was showing the transition when the wife was moving from one place to another, which is a way that I actually, admittedly, I hadn't thought about it. But I did think, I don't know if there was a seat bar on it, but I do think it was strange. What do people want from this sort of programme? I don't know. I think it'd be really interesting to do some sort of Twitter poll or debate just to see what the general consensus is about this sort of programme. Do people want to be shown something they don't know or something that they do know? And just to pick up that point about imagined dialogue, imagine probably was too strong a word. Imagination has a very key role, I think, in history. As historians, we do have to have quite a strong imagination, as long as it's within reason. But it is partly fictional, and we can't get away from that. We don't have an actual dialogue. Even when we do have dialogue that's descended to us from the 16th century, that may be fabricated itself. So we're never really going to be able to know exactly what these people said. And I know that Worsley did say at the beginning that a lot of it is based on documentary evidence. But I think certain types of reenactment, extended reenactment, that we got in this programme, a lot of it needs to sort of not stay on the stage, but the programme needs to figure out what identity it has. I mean, is it a drama, or is it a documentary, or is it a new hybrid of the two that for some reason doesn't quite sit okay with me at the moment? I mean, that points to the sort of innovation behind the programme, that it's making people question, particularly people like me maybe who have seen too many of these documentaries on Tudor England, to question how can we actually move forward. And I think that's one of the main, although arguing against emotion, I think that is one of the main successes of what Worsley has done, is that she's making people not just talk about the Six Wives, she's making people talk about the presentation of history in the academic domain and in the public domain. You just have to go on Twitter and people are talking about it. And I think I could probably go on, but I think I'll leave it there. But yeah, and I just want to thank Liz for some really great points that she made as well. So,
no, I think that's a fantastic place to take it to, because then it's kind of point of agreement that even if you do have problems with this programme, it's raised some really important and interesting questions. And I think just to pick out a couple of the key points that I think are really important, Liz, I absolutely agree that this is not necessarily for us. This is for some people, this might be the start of their journey into this history, and we've got to keep that in mind. But then similarly, as Katie points out, how do you make it about the history without sidelining it with the drama, right? How do you balance those two things together? And you were absolutely right to bring up discussion on Twitter, because of course we would love to hear from the audience, right? We'd love to hear what people think, both about the programme and about this discussion. At History on the Box is what we are on Twitter, quick plug there. So yeah, please do get in touch and let us know what you thought. Just to bring us to a close then, I'd like to sincerely thank both of our debaters, both Liz and Katie. I think you both made some excellent points, and you did very well to respond to each other very quickly as well, that time pressure. I'd also like to thank the Leicester Learning Institute and Rachel and Lucy particularly for helping us with the filming of this, the School of History, Politics and International Relations as well for supporting this, and of course for the audience for listening to us. So thank you very much.